Okay, let's dive right in. We've got this collection of sources here, articles, reports, some quite strong claims, really, that seem to paint a picture of some big societal shifts happening in Europe.
That's right. It's a diverse set of materials, definitely bringing up different viewpoints and some pretty significant concerns, at least as presented in these sources.
So our mission today for you listening is to take this specific stack of material you've given us and really do a deep dive. We want to pull out the main ideas, the different angles they present.
Exactly. We want to understand what these sources are actually saying about the changes in Europe, especially around things like demographics, culture, and the tensions mentioned.
Right. And we should probably say up front, shouldn't we, that these sources, they contain some very strong opinions, potentially sensitive stuff.
Absolutely. And our role here isn't to judge or, fact check these claims. We're simply exploring what this specific source material puts forward.
We're staying impartial, just focusing on understanding the content presented to us.
Exactly. We're here to guide you through this material and how it frames these particular issues.
Okay, so diving into this collection, what's the big central theme? What really jumps out from these sources regarding change in Europe?
Well, a really dominant theme, it runs right through, is this intense focus on demographic shifts. The sources repeatedly ask questions about the future, the makeup of European nations.
Like how? What kind of questions?
Explicit questions like how many Germans will be left in Germany, or French people in France, English people in England, looking ahead.
And how do the sources try to illustrate this concern? Do they give specifics?
Oh yeah, these specific claims. For example, they bring up a French writer, Renard Camus, and his idea of the Great Replacement.
Ah, right. The sources frame that as the idea that immigration is like displacing native European
That's
populations.
how it's presented, yes. One source even calls it the biggest thing to happen to France since the 15th century. Quite a statement.
And directly linked to that, there's a claim in the sources, isn't there, about the native French population becoming a minority.
Yes, a rapidly decreasing minority is the phrase used.
And it's not just France they point to, is it?
No, not at all. They claim London is now so diverse that white Britons are a minority here. That's a direct quote presented.
And Birmingham, too, I think. Something about white families becoming a minority group.
That's right, set to become a minority group for the first time. So you can see this collection really builds a narrative around these significant ethnic shifts. They frame it as absolutely central.
Okay, so building on that demographic picture, the sources then seem to put a really strong emphasis on religion, specifically religious demographics.
Yes, definitely. This is presented as a major factor driving the changes they're describing. The sources highlight that the country's most rapidly growing demographic is Muslim.
And they use that detail about the most popular baby name in London.
They do. They note that Mohammed is cited as the most popular name for baby boys in London.
And the sources seem to use that detail to support a broader claim. Something about birth rates changing the political landscape.
Exactly. The claim presented is that a high Muslim birth rate is changing the political landscape.
Now, there's a really significant point made repeatedly in these sources, and it's quite stark. It's about Sharia law.
Yes, this is certainly a key focus in the material provided.
Hmm.
The sources mention an individual named Imran.
And he's quoted saying he's looking forward to replacing Belgian law with Sharia.
That's the quote presented, yes.
Hmm.
Looking forward to replacing Belgian law with Sharia law.
And the sources list specific punishments mentioned in that context, don't they?
We do, quite explicitly. They're
Yeah.
presented as amputation for theft, stoning for adultery, and death to homos.
Wow. And then they bring up a survey result about British Muslims.
Stating that 40% of British Muslims want Islamic Sharia law in the United Kingdom.
And crucially, they immediately repeat those punishments again in the context of the survey.
Right, amputations and stonings. It seems the sources use these details, repeating them, to really emphasize what they portray as a clash with existing legal systems in Europe.
Okay, alongside that, the sources also include some, well, incredibly stark examples of what they present as radical voices and assertions.
Yes, they do. They describe footage they reference showing a demonstration outside the Danish embassy in London.
And they make a point about one demonstrator's appearance.
Yes, specifically noting that one demonstrator was dressed as a suicide bomber. That detail is highlighted.
And there's a direct threat quoted from that demonstration, too.
There is. It's quoted as, "Pull your troops out of Iraq." And if you do not pull your troops out, you will get bloodshed on the streets of London.
And the sources added detail about the aftermath or lack thereof.
Yes, they point out that no one was arrested in that instance. That's presented as significant.
There's also this really potent viewpoint presented, framed as a radical assertion, something about Islam dominating.
That's right. The sources present this view that Islam will dominate, dominating the East of the East and the West of the West, and stating Islam will be implemented no matter what.
And they're quite explicit about the claimed goals.
Yes, stating the goal as Muslim domination of the United Kingdom, if not the world. That's the articulation found in the source material.
And they illustrate this with a description of a poster showing Buckingham Palace.
A poster showing transforming Buckingham Palace into a local mosque.
And there was a claim about the Queen's choice in that context.
Yes, the source presents the claim that the choice is either become Muslim or she can leave the countries.
Then the sources introduce a specific figure, Amjad Chowdhury.
Described as a leader who demands Islamic law known as Sharia to be the law of the land.
And they list specific things he supposedly wants banned.
Yes, the sources say he demands bans on drugs will be banned, pornography will be banned, gambling will be banned.
And his strategy, according to these sources,
is described as being to pit Muslims against everyone else to create tension.
Right. And there's a quote from him about expecting a struggle.
Yes, expecting a struggle of words and maybe even more than that before Sharia is implemented at the state level. That's how it's quoted.
And the phrase Muslims are here to stay is presented as a recurring theme.
It's presented as a repeated assertion within the sources, yes.
And then there's this viewpoint offered, linking Europe to the U.S.
Yeah, the idea presented is that the radicalization seen in Britain and Europe will, in some part, be a model for what the United States can expect.
And finally, on this theme, the sources pose these questions.
Right, framed within this context. Why is Islam the biggest religion in the world? Why is Islam the fastest growing religion in the world? Posed almost rhetorically, it seems.
Okay, so moving on from the religious and cultural dynamics, these sources also point pretty strongly towards friction and serious issues they attribute to these changes, particularly around crime.
Yes, absolutely. The sources present specific examples and statistics that they claim demonstrate negative consequences stemming from these demographic and cultural shifts they've been describing.
A major claim mentioned is about Norway, isn't it? A rape epidemic.
Yes, a rape epidemic in Norway, which the sources directly attribute to Muslim immigration.
And they back this up with specific police statistics from Oslo.
They do cite specific stats, stating that 100% of assault rapes between strangers were committed by immigrant non-Western males, and that 9 out of 10 of their victims were native Norwegian women. That's the data presented.
The sources also mention increased crime in Sweden.
Yes, claims about increased crime in some areas of Sweden are included.
And they bring up the Rotherham child sexual abuse scandal?
They do, citing the numbers involved as presented in the source material. At least 1,400 children over a period of 16 years. A truly harrowing case.
And the sources specify the heritage of the perpetrators in that case.
Yes. They include the detail that the perpetrators were described as being of Pakistani heritage. The sources appear to use these examples to draw a very direct line between immigration and specific crime problems.
Beyond crime statistics, the sources also seem to touch on cultural clashes.
They describe a situation, for instance, regarding a gay pride march through a predominantly Muslim neighborhood here in Stockholm.
And they present the view that this could cause problems.
Yes, presenting the view it could stoke tensions. And they include a quote from the source material describing it specifically as a provocation against the Muslim population.
The sources also feature critiques of multiculturalism itself, don't they? Presenting it as maybe flawed.
Yes, that viewpoint is definitely present. One perspective offered is that Europe's history is fundamentally based on a Christian understanding.
Leading to the claim that, more recently, Europe has sort of lost it.
Exactly, that Europe has lost it in the past decade and emphasized multiculturalism to the point of losing our own root. That's the argument presented.
And there's also a claim about what happens if people disagree with immigration in Sweden.
Yes, that Swedes who disagree risk being labeled racist, fascist, even Nazi.
And they mention some footage related to that, of attacks.
They do. They describe footage mentioned in the sources showing the Revolutionary Front smashing the home of a suspected fascist, then filming and publishing these attacks online. It's presented as evidence of, well, social conflict or breakdown.
So the sources definitely paint this picture of significant social friction, crime concerns.
And they explicitly link it within their narrative to the changes they describe and often to a critique of multiculturalism itself.
Right. It's clear that these sources, for the most part, present a really strong perspective that's critical of immigration and its effects. They focus heavily on those points we just discussed.
They certainly do.
But interestingly, even within this collection, there are glimpses of other angles, right? Broader narratives, sometimes even conflicting ones.
That's a really important point to make. It's not entirely monolithic, even though that critical narrative is dominant. You do find different voices, different ideas about what's happening and why, even just within this specific set of materials we're looking at.
Like, for example, they briefly include what are presented as migrant experiences.
There are mentions of migrants being described as very bored or complaining about slow internet, sort of mundane details.
And the desire expressed to go to Germany, because Germany is very good.
Yes, that's mentioned. And then there are also these appeals included, which the sources present as coming directly from migrants.
One's asking for help.
Yeah. Try to help us. We're receiving bad condition. Try to help us. We are dying. We are dying. We beg you. We beg you because we suffer too much. Very raw pleas presented there.
But then, contrasting with that, there's also an observation presented in the sources about the migrants themselves.
That they are mostly men, and they're strong men, primetime soldiers. That observation is included as well.
The sources also contain critiques aimed elsewhere, like at policies or systems.
Definitely. There's the view expressed that the U.S. is somehow responsible for refugee flows, framed as, you make war and we get the refugees.
And a UN report is cited about Sweden's future.
Yes, claiming Sweden will be a third world nation in about 15 years below Libya and Bulgaria. That specific claim from a cited report is included.
And there are also some pretty defiant statements attributed to migrants within the sources.
There are things like, we are here to stay, and your democracy is empty because you are racist, and we're not going to feel of you because we are more stronger. We defeat you. These are presented as responses perhaps to hostility or systemic issues they perceive.
And there's criticism of specific leaders too, like Merkel.
Yes, a viewpoint critical of Merkel's policy in Germany, just flatly calling it insane.
Now, if we step back a bit, the sources also present some really broad, overarching narratives about what this societal transformation actually is.
They do, and they can be quite contradictory. For instance, there's the perspective found in one part of the source material that supremacists has schemed to promote immigration and miscegenation with the deliberate aim of breeding us out of existence.
Which is then framed incredibly strongly as
the biggest genocide in human history. A very extreme claim presented there.
But then, strikingly, the collection contrasts that with the totally different viewpoint presented elsewhere in the material.
Exactly. Stating that Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural, but is now going into a multicultural mode, and framing this as a huge transformation that Europe is actively undergoing.
And then there's that really specific, quite complex viewpoint presented about the role of Jewish people in this.
Yes, about Jews being potentially at the center of that. Maybe facing resentment because of a leading role, but arguing that without that leading role and without that transformation, Europe will not survive. It's a very layered argument presented there.
And finally, just briefly mention, is this idea of forging a new world order.
Where the rule of law governs the conduct of nations, and this would be fulfilled by a credible United Nations. That concept surfaces briefly.
So you can really see, even just within the specific set of sources we're examining, a huge range of perspectives, deep anxieties, and even fundamentally contradictory ideas about the nature and purpose of the changes they describe.
Absolutely. Everything from accusations of genocide to an embrace of a necessary multicultural mode. It's quite a spectrum.
Okay, so to sort of wrap up our look at these sources, there's this fascinating, almost jarring shift in perspective right at the end, presented through details about a video game.
Yeah, it's a really striking inclusion, isn't it? It seems to illustrate how anxieties about societal collapse, perhaps anxieties fueled by some of the issues raised elsewhere in these very sources, are being explored or maybe even marketed in popular culture.
They introduced this Ubisoft game, The Division, and its premise is about saving a world after a virus outbreak and collapse.
That's the setup described. And the sources then detail how, to promote this game, Ubisoft launched something called Collapse, the first end of society simulator.
Right. And the idea of the simulator is you start a virus on your own street and watch how society breaks down.
Exactly. Based on, and this is highlighted, real facts and real data across 3,800 cities worldwide to model how that collapse might happen.
And they list specific data points used in the simulator, things that underscore fragility.
Yes, things mentioned in the source, like only 2.6 hospital beds are available for 1,000 inhabitants,
Or that supermarkets only have 3 days worth of food provisions.
and that a nuclear power plant ceases to work after 2 days if there's major absenteeism. Really specific vulnerability points.
And the simulator apparently asks the player a key question.
Would you stay or would you leave? And it states that your choices determine how fast the world will collapse.
And the sources note its success.
They do. That in less than a week, 1 million people tried the simulator, and it helped the main game, The Division, break Ubisoft sales records.
Wow. So it's this sort of fascinating glimpse, isn't it, into how anxieties about society being fragile, which maybe echo some themes in the other source material.
How those anxieties can manifest and clearly resonate quite powerfully in unexpected places, like a video game simulator.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a deep dive into what is really an intense collection of viewpoints and information about Europe as it's all presented in these specific sources.
It certainly presents a challenging picture, doesn't it? Filled with very strong claims, deep anxieties about identity and safety, and fundamental disagreements about where society is heading. It even touches on that stark idea of collapse, reflected in the simulator.
So just to recap for everyone listening, we've navigated this specific collection of sources, tracing the themes they present. The claims about demographic change and the Great Replacement idea, the focus on Muslim growth and calls for Sharia, the specific claims about crime rates and causes, the cultural clashes described, the different migrant experiences as they are presented in these sources, those broader narratives about societal transformation, and even how these anxieties are mirrored in something like that simulation game.
And it really underscores, I think, that trying to understand complex issues often means grappling with very different, sometimes sharply conflicting perspectives, like the ones presented in source material such as this. Our aim today was just to show you what these specific sources put forward and how they frame these issues.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for you to ponder. Drawing from the range of fears and aspirations expressed across this quite diverse collection of sources we've looked at, considering all these anxieties about identity, safety, the future, and those contrasting ideas about transformation versus displacement, how might these different narratives we encounter about societal change actually shape not just how we understand the present, but also how we prepare for or expect the future?